all of there are a number of other things that they're doing. I won't describe them in any more detail, although I'd be happy to go back and speak about them a little bit more. Well, let me mention two others. They are putting in place emergency regulatory procedures and for land use decision making, building permits, and for contracting requirements that will make it easier to fast track permitting if people want to rebuild, that will make it easier to let contracts without the usual delay that government contracting procedures require. And again, thinking about what that would look like, putting the legal authority in place in a contingent way so that after a disaster, the mayor could say, okay, I'm now invoking my emergency authorities. These contingent procedures will now be in place, and they can get on with the business of recovery without waiting for a couple of weeks or even a couple of months to go through the process of revising the laws and changing the way that people are allowed to do things. All of these are very low-cost measures. They require some thinking, some planning. Making sure that there's money available has a bit more of an expense attached to it, but it doesn't have to be gigantic. But I think it's very important to see these as an example of a different sort of activity than the other four leverage points. Taken together, these five leverage points, which we call the Comprehensive Risk Management Framework, very similar to what you have here, are using here in Vietnam and in Indonesia, excuse me, and I also work in Vietnam. Pardon me. What you have in Indonesia, the way that a number of countries are thinking about these issues, but what most governments do not think about is an allocation of investment of resources competitively across those five areas. Do we have a budget, or at least a notional way, even if it's not an immediate budget, do we have a notional way of thinking about all of these things together? And asking the question, if we have an extra rupiah, where are we going to invest it? Are we going to hire another police officer? Are we going to spend it on recovery? Are we going to spend it on preparing for response? Which of these leverage points deserves the next amount of money that we have available to spend? And very few jurisdictions are thinking in this comprehensive way about the investments that they make, even though the total investments are quite substantial in most societies. I think there's some easy explanations for that. In most countries, there are multiple units of government and multiple levels of government that are making these expenditures, and so no single government has responsible for all of the expenditures. They lack the data, and sometimes they lack the motivation to add them up. A second reason is that, and I think this is extremely important, not only for this point but for others, that the agencies and the ministries that are in charge of some of these functions are totally different from the ministries that are responsible for other ones. So response, for example, at least in my country, the core public agencies that are responsible are the police department, the fire department, the emergency medical services, increasingly public health, because of disease considerations, puts itself there. But those are the core agencies that deal with that. A few other agencies are starting to think of themselves as part of that circle. In the U.S., transportation agencies, public works, and a few others are getting engaged. But they don't think of themselves as being the prime movers in those areas. If we shift to recovery, though, we're speaking about a completely different set of agencies. We're speaking about social service agencies. We're thinking about development and housing agencies, perhaps the school department. They certainly don't think of themselves as emergency managers, and they don't have much to do with the emergency management agencies on a day-to-day basis, or even really in special committees. Prevention and mitigation tend to be the realm of yet another set of agencies. We have the Army Corps of Engineers, which builds dams and canals. We have organizations that are responsible for building infrastructure projects. Those tend to be at higher levels of government. They tend to have capital construction responsibilities. They don't think of themselves as emergency managers either. So that this division of responsibility makes it very hard to think in a comprehensive fashion, becomes an institutional or bureaucratic obstacle to thinking across the different elements of this risk framework, as does the fact that there are multiple levels of government that spend money, multiple agencies that spend money, which makes it hard to think about budgeting. My colleague and I have challenged a few jurisdictions in the United States to at least go through the planning exercise of thinking of a comprehensive budget for emergency management and disaster risk reduction. Nobody yet has, some jurisdictions have been interested. No one has yet taken us up on it. Perhaps Indonesia might want to be the first to do that. So now I would like to actually let me pause here and invite comment or discussion, because I'm going to move on to some different issues, and I would be happy to take questions or comments. Please.
Yeah, can you give me a concrete example so I can differentiate really between prevention, mitigation, and this advanced recovery? Because
what is the difference?
Yeah, because you say recovery mostly is after the event. So we have early recovery, but advanced recovery, how you...
The distinction that I would make is this. Prevention and mitigation try to affect what the event itself does. So prevention obviously tries to say, no dam rupture that will cause us all sorts of problems. Mitigation would say, let's build levees that are stronger so that even if they're overtopped by a very big storm surge, we will not have the levees rupture as they did in New Orleans and then pour water in. So those measures try to reduce the physical damage from the natural disaster or whatever sort of event it is, and are focused, as that arrow indicates, on the event. What we mean by advanced recovery is to say the event has happened. It is either very severe or it's less severe if our mitigation efforts have succeeded. But it has happened, and there is damage to people, property, cultural aspects, environment, etc. Are there things that we could have done before the disaster happened that would make it easier to recover? We know there will be damage. As good as our efforts to mitigate are, we are still going to have that damage. So how can we take steps today that will reduce the cost of doing the recovery? Or make it faster. So if we're not going to be able to get access to money because our credit rating has declined, can we take steps that would assure us of access to credit? If we are going to need to very quickly issue building permits, let contracts for rubble removal, or for people to come in and provide temporary shelter, can we have emergency contracting authority or emergency regulatory authority that would let us deal with those issues in advance? If we have labor contracts, something I didn't mention before, with our public employees that prohibit certain kinds of activities under normal circumstances, can we, or perhaps that define specific work rules as we have in the United States, or if there's civil service regulations that limit what personnel are allowed to do, can we have emergency provisions that can cut through some of that red tape and let us deploy people as we need to in the recovery? So I would distinguish advanced recovery as the things that are going to be addressed to whatever the level of damage is when the event is over, that lets us deal with them more expeditiously.